Sarah Chen always sat in the back row of her music class. She picked the seat behind the tall boy with messy hair so no one would notice her. Every day, she walked into room 204 with her plain black backpack and her old music folder. She never raised her hand to answer questions. She never volunteered to play piano in front of the class. Mrs. Henderson, the music teacher, barely looked at Sarah most days. When she did notice her, it was only to make sure Sarah was paying attention. Mrs. Henderson had been teaching music for 25 years. She could spot talent from across the room. The talented students sat in the front. They wore nice clothes and carried expensive instrument cases. Their parents came to every school concert. Sarah was not one of those students. Her clothes came from the discount store downtown. Her shoes had small holes that she tried to hide with black marker. She lived with her grandmother in a small apartment above the Chinese restaurant on Main Street. Her grandmother worked 14 hours a day in the restaurant kitchen. There was no money for piano lessons or fancy music books, but Sarah loved music more than anything else in the world. Every morning, she woke up to the sound of her grandmother cooking breakfast in their tiny kitchen. The smell of rice and eggs filled their small home. Sarah would eat quickly, kiss her grandmother goodbye, and walk 6 blocks to school. She always arrived 15 minutes early. Not because she was eager for classes to start, but because she wanted to walk past the music room and hear the advanced students practice before school began. She would stop outside the door and listen. The sounds that came from inside made her heart race. Beautiful melodies flowed from expensive pianos. Students played songs that told stories without words. Their fingers moved across the keys like dancers. Sarah closed her eyes and imagined herself playing those same beautiful songs. But when music class started, reality hit her like cold water. "Sarah, can you play the C major scale for us?" Mrs. Henderson asked one Tuesday morning. Sarah's face turned red. All eyes in the room were on her. She walked slowly to the old upright piano at the front of the class. Her hands shook as she placed her fingers on the keys. She played the simple scale correctly, but her playing sounded flat and lifeless compared to the other students. "Thank you, Sarah." "That was adequate," Mrs. Henderson said with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Adequate. The word stung like a slap. Sarah returned to her seat while whispers followed her. "She's so boring," someone said behind her. "Why does she even take music class?" another voice added. Sarah pretended not to hear, but each comment cut deep into her heart. She opened her notebook and drew small hearts in the margins while Mrs. Henderson talked about rhythm and melody. The hearts looked sad, just like Sarah felt inside. During lunch, Sarah sat alone at the corner table near the windows. She watched the popular kids laugh and share their expensive sandwiches. The music students sat together at their own special table. They talked about piano competitions and summer music camps. Sarah ate her peanut butter sandwich and wished she could be invisible. After lunch came the worst part of the day: advanced music class. Sarah wasn't supposed to be in advanced music. Her grades in regular music were just average, but the school needed to fill the class, so they moved some students up. Sarah was one of them, not because she showed promise, but because they needed more bodies and seats. The advanced students made it clear she didn't belong there. "Why is she here?" whispered Jessica, the star pianist who had won 3 regional competitions. "Maybe they made a mistake," replied Marcus, whose family owned the music store downtown. Mrs. Henderson pretended not to hear these comments, but Sarah saw the teacher's slight nod of agreement. It was clear that Mrs. Henderson thought Sarah's presence in advanced class was indeed a mistake. The advanced students played pieces that sounded like magic. Their fingers flew across the piano keys with confidence and grace. When they made mistakes, they laughed and tried again without embarrassment. When Sarah made mistakes, the room fell silent with awkward tension. Mrs. Henderson had different expectations for different students. When Jessica played, the teacher would say things like, "Beautiful expression, dear. Try adding more emotion to that passage." When Marcus played, she would offer helpful suggestions about technique and timing. When Sarah played, Mrs. Henderson would simply say, "That's fine, Sarah. Please take your seat." Just fine. Never beautiful. Never impressive. Just fine. One day, Sarah decided to ask for help after class. She waited until all the other students had left, then approached Mrs. Henderson's desk. "Mrs. Henderson, could you give me some extra practice songs?" Sarah asked quietly. The teacher looked up from her gradebook with surprise. "Oh, Sarah. Well, I think you should focus on mastering the basics first. The pieces we're doing in class are challenging enough for your level." "But I practice every day," Sarah said. "I think I could handle something harder." Mrs. Henderson smiled that same polite smile. "I'm sure you do practice, dear, but there's a difference between practicing and truly understanding music. Some students have natural talent and others—" She paused, looking for gentle words. "Others work very hard and do their best." The message was clear. Sarah was in the second group, the ones who tried hard but would never be truly good. Sarah nodded and left the classroom with burning cheeks and watery eyes. She walked home slowly that day, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Her grandmother always said, "Work hard, be patient, and good things will come." But sometimes, Sarah wondered if good things only came to people who were already special. That night, Sarah sat at the old keyboard in her bedroom. It was missing 3 keys and the volume button was broken, so it was always too loud or too quiet. She played the simple songs from her music book, but her heart wasn't in it. She felt trapped between wanting to improve and being told she wasn't good enough to try. She looked out her window at the city lights and made a secret promise to herself. Somehow, someway, she would prove that she was more than just adequate. She would show everyone, including Mrs. Henderson, that quiet girls from small apartments could make beautiful music too. But first, she had to figure out how. Spring had arrived at Lincoln High School, and with it came the annual spring recital. Bright yellow posters appeared on every bulletin board in the school. "Spring Music Recital. Show your talent," they announced in bold letters. Below the title was a picture of a grand piano surrounded by musical notes. Sarah stared at one of these posters during her lunch break. Other students walked past without giving it a second look, but Sarah couldn't take her eyes off it. The recital was in 6 weeks. Any student in the music program could audition for a spot in the show. "Are you thinking about trying out?" asked a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Amy Rodriguez, a girl from her regular English class. Amy was friendly but not part of the music crowd. She played guitar in her church youth group. "Oh, I don't know," Sarah said quietly. "I'm not really good enough for something like that. How do you know if you don't try?" Amy smiled. "My dad always says you miss 100% of the shots you don't take." Sarah thought about Amy's words for the rest of the day. That evening, she sat at her broken keyboard and played through her simple songs again. They sounded so basic compared to what she heard in advanced music class. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered, "What if?" The next morning, Sarah arrived at school extra early. She walked to the music department office where Mrs. Henderson was sorting through sheet music for the day's classes. Sarah stood in the doorway for a full minute trying to find courage. "Did you need something, Sarah?" Mrs. Henderson asked without looking up. "I was wondering about the spring recital," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, yes. It's going to be wonderful this year. Jessica is preparing a Chopin piece and Marcus is working on a Bach invention. Very impressive students." Sarah took a deep breath. "Could I audition too?" Mrs. Henderson finally looked up, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "You want to audition for the recital?" "Yes, ma'am." The teacher set down her papers and really looked at Sarah for the first time in months. Sarah saw doubt flash across Mrs. Henderson's face, followed by what looked like pity. "Well, Sarah, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but the spring recital is our showcase event. Parents come from all over town. The school board attends. We need our performers to represent the music program at its very best." "I understand," Sarah said. "But I'd like to try." Mrs. Henderson sighed. "The audition pieces are quite challenging. I'm not sure you're ready for that level of difficulty. What if I just try? If I'm not good enough, then I won't make it. But couldn't I at least audition?" The teacher looked at Sarah for a long moment. Maybe she saw something in the girl's eyes that she hadn't noticed before. Or maybe she just didn't want to seem mean by saying no outright. All right, Mrs. Henderson said finally. I suppose everyone deserves a chance. Come back after school today and I'll give you your audition piece. Sarah's heart jumped with excitement. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, thank you so much. She spent the rest of the day in a daze. During math class, she drew musical notes in her notebook margins. During history class, she imagined herself on stage, playing for a real audience. During science class, she wondered what song Mrs. Henderson would choose for her. After school, Sarah practically ran to the music room. Mrs. Henderson was waiting with a folder of sheet music. Now, Sarah, I've chosen something that I think will suit your current skill level, the teacher said, pulling out a piece of music. This is Für Elise by Beethoven. It's a lovely piece and not too difficult. Sarah looked at the sheet music. She recognized the song immediately. It was pretty and gentle with a simple melody that repeated throughout. She had heard it played in movies and commercials. It was the kind of piece that beginning piano students learned. It's perfect for you, Mrs. Henderson continued. It's beautiful and appropriate for your abilities. You'll have 6 weeks to prepare, which should be plenty of time for a piece like this. Sarah nodded and took the music, but something twisted in her stomach. Around them, other students were receiving their audition pieces. Jessica got a thick packet of pages filled with complex notes and difficult passages. Marcus received a Bach piece that looked like mathematical equations written in musical form. Sarah's piece had large, simple notes with plenty of space between them. It looked like music for a child. Thank you, Sarah said, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice. You're very welcome, dear. Now practice carefully and remember to play with good posture. If you work hard, I'm sure you'll do just fine. Just fine. There were those words again. Sarah walked home with the sheet music tucked carefully in her backpack. The spring air felt fresh and full of possibilities, but her heart felt heavy. She had gotten what she asked for, a chance to audition, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Henderson had already decided Sarah would be the warm-up act, the student who played the simple song before the real performers took the stage. That evening, Sarah sat at her keyboard and played through Für Elise for the first time. Her fingers found the notes easily. The melody was indeed beautiful, flowing like a gentle stream. But it was so simple that she had it mostly memorized after just 2 run-throughs. Her grandmother came home from work just as Sarah was finishing her 3rd practice session. That sounds very pretty, little bird, her grandmother said, using her pet name for Sarah. What song is that? It's for a school concert, Sarah explained. It's called Für Elise. Her grandmother sat down on Sarah's bed and listened as Sarah played the piece again. When she finished, her grandmother clapped softly. Beautiful, she said. But you look sad. What's wrong? Sarah tried to explain how she felt without sounding ungrateful. It's just, everyone else got harder songs, more impressive songs. I think my teacher gave me this because she doesn't think I can handle anything difficult. Her grandmother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You know, in China there is a saying, the loudest duck gets shot first. Sometimes it is better to surprise people than to show them everything at once. Sarah wasn't sure what her grandmother meant, but she smiled anyway. Her grandmother always had sayings that seemed mysterious, but somehow made sense later. Over the next few days, Sarah watched her classmates struggle with their audition pieces. Jessica spent hours after school working on the fast sections of her Chopin piece. Marcus had to slow down his Bach invention to half speed just to hit the right notes. Meanwhile, Sarah could play Für Elise perfectly after just a week of practice. She played it in the morning before school. She played it during lunch when the music room was empty. She played it at home until her grandmother hummed along from the kitchen. But instead of feeling proud, Sarah felt more disappointed each day. The piece was pretty, but it didn't challenge her. It didn't make her heart race or her fingers stretch to reach difficult chords. It didn't tell an exciting story or paint colorful pictures in her mind. 2 weeks into her preparation, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find a way to prove that she was capable of more than just playing simple songs. She didn't know how yet, but she was determined to show everyone, including herself, that quiet girls could be extraordinary too. The question was, did she have the courage to do what she was thinking about doing? 3 weeks before the recital auditions, Sarah made a discovery that would change her life forever. She was walking through the old wing of Lincoln High School, looking for a quiet place to eat her lunch away from the crowded cafeteria. Most students avoided this part of the building because it smelled like old books and the heating didn't work properly in winter. Sarah pushed open a heavy wooden door marked Music Storage and found herself in a room she had never seen before. Dust. Particles danced in the sunlight that streamed through tall, dirty windows. Old music stands stood in corners like forgotten soldiers. Sheet music was scattered on shelves that reached up to the ceiling, but in the center of the room sat something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. A grand piano. It was covered with a thick gray cloth, but Sarah could see its elegant shape underneath. She walked slowly toward it, her heart beating faster with each step. This wasn't like the old upright piano in her music classroom or the broken keyboard in her bedroom. This was a real concert piano, the kind she had only seen in movies. Sarah looked around to make sure she was alone, then carefully lifted the cloth. The piano was old but beautiful, made of rich, dark wood that gleamed even under the dust. The keys were yellowed with age, but when Sarah pressed middle C, the sound that came out was pure and sweet. She sat down on the bench and placed her hands on the keyboard. The keys felt different from any piano she had ever played. They responded to the slightest touch, creating sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the instrument's soul. Sarah played a simple scale, and the notes filled the empty room with warmth. Then she played Für Elise, and even that simple piece sounded more beautiful than it ever had before. "Hello?" A voice called from the doorway. Sarah jumped up so quickly that the piano bench nearly fell over. She turned to see Mr. Johnson, the school janitor, standing in the doorway with a bucket and mop. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her face burning with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to be in here, I was just—" "Relax, kiddo," Mr. Johnson said with a kind smile. "You're not in trouble. I was just surprised to hear music coming from in here. Nobody's played that piano in years." "Is it okay if I'm here?" Sarah asked quietly. Mr. Johnson set down his cleaning supplies and walked over to the piano. He ran his hand along its wooden surface with something that looked like love in his eyes. "This old beauty used to be the crown jewel of the music program," he said. "Back when I first started working here 20 years ago, students would line up to practice on her. She's got the most beautiful tone of any piano in the school." "Why doesn't anyone play it anymore?" Sarah asked. "Budget cuts," Mr. Johnson said sadly. "The school built the new music room and bought newer pianos. They moved this one in here and just forgot about her. Such a shame." He looked at Sarah carefully. "You play pretty well. Are you in the music program?" Sarah nodded. "I'm trying out for the spring recital." "Good for you," Mr. Johnson said. "Listen, I come in here to clean every day around this time. The room's not being used for anything else. If you want to practice on a real piano instead of those electronic keyboards they have in the classrooms, you're welcome to come here during lunch or after school." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "Mind? I'd be happy to hear some life in this old room again. Just make sure you keep the door closed so you don't disturb classes, and put the cover back on the piano when you're done." That afternoon, Sarah couldn't concentrate on any of her classes. All she could think about was the grand piano waiting for her in the storage room. As soon as the final bell rang, she grabbed her backpack and hurried to the old wing of the building. The piano was exactly as she had left it, covered and waiting. Sarah uncovered it carefully and sat down at the bench. She started with Für Elise, but after playing it through once, she felt hungry for something more challenging. Sarah had a secret that nobody at school knew about. For the past 2 years, she had been teaching herself piano through online videos and free sheet music she found on the internet. Late at night, when her grandmother was asleep, Sarah would put on headphones and watch piano tutorials on the old laptop her grandmother had bought at a garage sale. She had learned to read music, better than most of her classmates realized. She had studied finger techniques and practiced scales until her fingers were sore. But she had never had a proper piano to practice on, only her broken keyboard that was missing keys and made every song sound flat and electronic. Now, sitting At this beautiful grand piano, Sarah felt like an artist who had finally found the right canvas. She pulled out her phone and found a video she had watched dozens of times. It was a tutorial for a piece called Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven. The instructor was a young woman who explained each section clearly and slowly. Sarah had memorized every note by watching and rewatching the video, but she had never been able to play it properly on her broken keyboard. Sarah placed her fingers on the keys and began to play the opening notes of the Moonlight Sonata. The sound that came from the grand piano was like nothing she had ever heard before. Each note was rich and full, creating a melody that seemed to tell a story of mystery and beauty. Her left hand played the gentle repeating pattern while her right hand sang the haunting melody above it. Sarah had practiced this piece so many times in her mind and on her silent keyboard that her fingers knew exactly where to go. But hearing it played on a real piano, with all the subtle dynamics and expression she had only imagined, brought tears to her eyes. She played through the entire first movement without making a single mistake. When the last note faded away, Sarah sat in stunned silence. She had just played a piece that was far more complex and beautiful than Für Elise, and she had played it well. Over the next week, Sarah spent every lunch period and every free moment after school in the storage room with the grand piano. She worked through pieces she had been learning online, parts of Bach inventions, simple Chopin waltzes, and even some jazz pieces she had found in tutorial videos. Each day, she discovered that her fingers were stronger and more flexible than she had realized. The grand piano responded to every touch, every emotion she put into her playing. It was like having a conversation with a wise old friend who understood exactly what she was trying to say. Sarah began to understand that she had been holding herself back all this time. The broken keyboard at home and the old upright piano in music class had made every piece sound ordinary. But this instrument brought out colors and emotions in her playing that she never knew existed. One afternoon, while practicing a particularly difficult passage, Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway outside. She quickly stopped playing and listened. The footsteps passed by without stopping, but Sarah realized something important. She had been taking a huge risk. What if Mrs. Henderson found out about her secret practice sessions? What if she discovered that Sarah had been learning pieces far more advanced than Für Elise? Would the teacher be impressed, or would she be angry that Sarah hadn't been honest about her abilities? More importantly, what was Sarah going to do with all this new knowledge and skill? She was supposed to play Für Elise at her audition in 3 weeks. It was a pretty piece, but now it seemed so simple and boring compared to the music she had been discovering. Sarah sat at the piano bench and stared at her hands. These hands had just played music that she never would have believed she was capable, for they had found their way through complex passages and brought beautiful melodies to life. For the first time since starting high school, Sarah began to believe that maybe she was more than just adequate. Maybe she was actually good at something. Maybe she was even talented. But what was she going to do about it? Did she have the courage to show everyone what she was really capable of? Or would she play it safe and stick with the simple piece that was expected of her? As Sarah covered the piano and prepared to leave, she made a decision that both terrified and excited her. She was going to keep practicing both pieces, the simple Für Elise that everyone expected, and something much more challenging that would show her true abilities. The question was, which one would she choose to play when the time came? 2 weeks before the auditions, Sarah discovered a piece of music that would change everything. She was browsing through online piano tutorials during her lunch break when she came across a video titled Chopin Revolutionary Etude, Full Tutorial. Sarah had heard of Chopin before. Mrs. Henderson sometimes mentioned him when talking about famous composers, but Sarah had never really listened to his music carefully. She clicked on the video out of curiosity. The moment the first notes began to play, Sarah felt electricity run through her entire body. The music was powerful and dramatic, starting with a thunderous crash of notes that seemed to shake the very ground. The left hand played fast, rolling passages that sounded like a storm, while the right hand sang a melody that was both sad and defiant. The video description explained that Chopin wrote this piece in 1831 after hearing that Warsaw, his home city, had fallen to Russian forces. The music expressed his anger, his sadness and his hope all at the same time. It was called the Revolutionary Etude because it sounded like a musical battle cry. Sarah watched the tutorial 3 times during her lunch period. The piece was incredibly difficult, with passages that required years of training to master. The left hand had to play rapid sequences of notes that most pianists spent months learning to execute properly. The right hand needed to sing above all that technical complexity with emotion and power. It was exactly the opposite of Für Elise in every way. That afternoon, Sarah hurried to the storage room where the grand piano waited for her. She pulled up the tutorial on her phone and began to learn the opening measures of the Revolutionary Etude. The first chord was a massive crash that used both hands. Sarah had never played anything so bold and dramatic. When she struck the keys, the sound filled the entire room with power. It was like being struck by lightning. Learning the left-hand passages was the hardest thing Sarah had ever attempted, on piano. Her fingers had to move faster than they ever had before, playing scales and arpeggios that twisted and turned through different keys. At first, she could only play a few notes at a time without making mistakes. But Sarah was determined. She had never wanted anything as much as she wanted to master this piece. Every afternoon, she practiced in the storage room until her fingers ached and her wrists were sore. She broke the piece down into tiny sections, learning just a few measures at a time. Mr. Johnson would sometimes stop by while she was practicing. He never said much, but Sarah could see the amazement in his eyes as her playing improved week by week. "That's some pretty advanced music you're working on there," he said one day. "It's probably too hard for me," Sarah replied, not stopping her practice. "Doesn't sound too hard to me," Mr. Johnson said with a smile. "Sounds like you're getting the hang of it just fine." Sarah had been practicing the Revolutionary Etude for a week when she realized she had to make a decision. The auditions were only 7 days away. She could play Für Elise perfectly. It was simple and safe. Mrs. Henderson expected it, and Sarah could perform it without any risk of embarrassing herself. But the Revolutionary Etude was calling to her like a siren song. Even though she had only been learning it for a week, she could already play the main sections. Her fingers were getting stronger and faster every day. The piece felt like it was written for her own emotions, all the frustration and determination she had been feeling for years. Sarah knew that choosing the Revolutionary Etude was a huge gamble. If she made mistakes during the audition, she would not only fail to make the recital, but she would also expose herself as someone who had been hiding her true abilities from her teacher. Mrs. Henderson might be angry that Sarah hadn't been honest about her skill level, but if she succeeded, Sarah spent her weekend practicing both pieces. She would play Für Elise to keep it fresh in her memory, then spend hours working on the challenging passages of the Revolutionary Etude. Her grandmother noticed that Sarah was practicing more than usual. "You work very hard on your music, little bird," her grandmother said on Sunday evening. "Your fingers are getting calluses like a real pianist." Sarah looked down at her fingertips. Her grandmother was right. She had developed small calluses from all the intense practice. They were marks she wore with pride. Proof that she was pushing herself beyond what anyone expected. That night, Sarah lay in bed and made lists in her mind, pros and cons of playing each piece. Für Elise pros: safe, expected, no chance of major embarrassment. Mrs. Henderson would approve. Für Elise cons: simple, boring, wouldn't show her real abilities, would prove Mrs. Henderson was right about her being just adequate. Revolutionary Etude pros: challenging, impressive, would shock everyone, would prove she was capable of more than anyone imagined. Revolutionary Etude cons: very risky, might fail spectacularly, could anger Mrs. Henderson, might not be ready in time. Monday morning arrived gray and rainy, matching Sarah's uncertain mood. She walked to school early as usual and stopped outside the music room. Through the door, she could hear Jessica practicing her Chopin piece. It sounded confident and polished. Then she heard Marcus working on his Bach invention. His fingers moved through the complex passages with ease, like he had been born to play that music. Sarah continued walking to her first class, but her mind stayed focused on the decision she had to make. In the storage room, the grand piano was waiting for her. ready to help her practice whichever piece she chose. During lunch, instead of going to the storage room right away, Sarah sat in the cafeteria and watched her classmates. Jessica and Marcus sat at their usual table with the other advanced music students. They talked and laughed easily, confident in their abilities and their place in the music program. At a table across the room, Amy Rodriguez waved at Sarah. Sarah waved back and thought about what Amy had said weeks ago. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Sarah made her decision. She was going to prepare both pieces, but she was leaning toward the revolutionary etude. She had 1 week to perfect it, 1 week to take the biggest musical risk of her life. That afternoon in the storage room, Sarah attacked the revolutionary etude with more determination than ever before. She practiced the left-hand passages until they flowed like water. She worked on the emotional melody in the right hand until it sang with power and beauty. By Thursday, Sarah could play the entire piece from memory without major mistakes. It wasn't perfect. There were still some rough spots in the most difficult sections. But it was recognizable, powerful, and moving. On Friday, exactly 1 week before auditions, Sarah played the revolutionary etude all the way through for the first time without stopping. When the final notes faded away, she sat at the piano bench with tears in her eyes. She had done it. She had learned one of the most challenging pieces in the piano literature in just 2 weeks. Her secret practice sessions over the past years had prepared her for this moment without her even realizing it. Now came the hardest part, finding the courage to actually perform it. Sarah covered the piano and gathered her things to leave. On Monday, she would have to tell Mrs. Henderson which piece she planned to audition with. She had spent weeks learning Für Elise perfectly, and she had spent the last 2 weeks mastering the revolutionary etude as much as humanly possible. In 3 days, she would have to make a choice that would define not just her audition, but her entire understanding of who she was as a musician and as a person. As she walked home through the evening twilight, Sarah felt the weight of possibility pressing down on her shoulders. She was no longer the quiet girl who sat in the back row. She was someone with a secret, someone with power, someone with a choice to make. The question was, did she have the courage to reveal who she really was? The night before auditions, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her small bed staring at the ceiling while her grandmother's soft snoring came from the next room. The numbers on her digital clock seemed to move in slow motion. 11:47 p.m., 11:48 p.m., 11:49 p.m. Sarah's mind kept switching between the two pieces like a radio jumping between stations. First, she would mentally play through Für Elise, her fingers twitching under the covers as she imagined pressing each key. The melody was so familiar now that it felt like breathing, safe, predictable, expected. Then her thoughts would shift to the revolutionary etude. Her heart would start racing as she imagined the opening crash, the powerful left-hand passages, the defiant melody that seemed to tell the world, I am here, and I matter. Dangerous, thrilling, impossible to ignore. At midnight, Sarah gave up trying to sleep. She crept quietly out of bed and sat at her broken keyboard with headphones on. She played Für Elise silently, her fingers moving over the keys without making any sound. Even without hearing the notes, she could feel how easy and gentle the piece was. Then she switched to the revolutionary etude. Playing it silently on her broken keyboard was almost funny. Such dramatic music coming from fingers that made no sound at all. But Sarah could hear every note in her mind, could feel the power and emotion that would pour out of a real piano. She had been practicing both pieces obsessively for the past week, but tonight she realized that her heart had already made the choice. Every time she played Für Elise, it felt like putting on clothes that were too small. The music couldn't contain everything she had learned about herself in that storage room with the grand piano, but choosing the revolutionary etude meant risking everything. Not just failing the audition, but revealing that she had been hiding her true abilities all along. It meant admitting that she was tired of being underestimated, tired of being called adequate, tired of sitting in the back row. At 1:30 a.m., Sarah's Phone buzzed with a text message from Amy Rodriguez. "Good luck tomorrow. You're going to do great." Sarah smiled in the darkness. Amy was one of the few people who believed in her without knowing anything about her secret practice sessions or her hidden abilities. Maybe that was a sign. Sarah finally fell asleep around 2 a.m., but her dreams were filled with piano music. Sometimes she dreamed she was playing for Elise, for an audience that looked bored and distracted. Other times she dreamed she was playing the revolutionary etude, but her fingers couldn't find the right keys and the music turned into a horrible mess. Her alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., but Sarah was already awake. She had been lying in bed for 20 minutes, watching the sunrise paint her bedroom walls with golden light. Today was the day that would change everything, one way or another. Sarah's grandmother was already in the kitchen when she stumbled out of her bedroom. The smell of congee and green tea filled their small apartment. "You look tired, little bird," her grandmother said, studying Sarah's face with concern. "Did you sleep?" "A little," Sarah said, sitting down at their tiny kitchen table. "Grandmother, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you were young in China, did you ever have to make a choice between being safe and being brave?" Her grandmother set down her teacup and looked at Sarah seriously. "Many times. The biggest choices in life are always between safe and brave." "What did you choose?" Her grandmother smiled and gestured around their small apartment above the restaurant. "I chose brave when I came to America with nothing but hope in my heart. I chose brave when I opened the restaurant even though I barely spoke English. I chose brave when I decided to raise you after your parents died." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She had never thought about how many brave choices her grandmother had made. "But sometimes," her grandmother continued, "I chose safe. And every time I chose safe instead of brave, I wondered what might have happened if I had taken the risk." "Do you regret the safe choices?" "Not regret exactly, but I always wondered. The safe choices gave me security, but the brave choices gave me the life I truly wanted." Sarah hugged her grandmother tightly. "I love you. I love you too, little bird. Whatever choice you make today, I am proud of you." Sarah arrived at school an hour early. The hallways were empty except for a few teachers preparing for the day. She went straight to the storage room where the grand piano waited for her like an old friend. She uncovered the piano and sat on the bench, but she didn't start playing right away. Instead, she just sat there, hands resting on the keys, feeling the weight of the decision she had to make. In 3 hours, she would walk into the music room for auditions. Mrs. Henderson would be sitting at her desk with her grade book and her polite smile. The other students would be there too, waiting their turn to show what they could do. Sarah thought about all the times Mrs. Henderson had called her adequate, all the whispered comments from other students about how boring she was, all the years she had spent believing that she wasn't good enough to deserve attention or respect. Then she thought about the past few weeks in this storage room, discovering that her fingers could create beauty and power that she never imagined possible. She thought about the feeling of playing music that matched the fire in her heart instead of dampening it. Sarah placed her hands on the keys and began to play, but instead of practicing either of her prepared pieces, she played something entirely different, a simple improvisation that came straight from her emotions. The melody started soft and uncertain, like a question being asked. Then it grew stronger and more confident, like someone finding their voice. As she played, Sarah realized that this wasn't really about the audition at all. It was about who she wanted to be for the rest of her life. Did she want to be the girl who played it safe and never surprised anyone? Or did she want to be the girl who took risks and showed the world what she was really capable of? When she finished her improvisation, Sarah knew exactly what she was going to do. She spent the next hour practicing the revolutionary etude one final time. Her fingers flew through the difficult passages with more confidence than ever before. The piece felt like it belonged to her now, like she had been born to play this music. At 8:15 a.m., students started arriving for regular classes. Sarah covered the piano and gathered her things. As she walked toward the door, she turned back for one last look at the instrument that had changed her life. "Thank you," she whispered to the grand piano, "for showing me who I really am." Sarah spent the morning classes in a strange, calm state. She had made her decision, and there was no going back now. During lunch, instead of practicing, she sat in the cafeteria and ate her sandwich slowly, watching her classmates rush around with nervous energy about their auditions. Jessica kept checking her phone and muttering about fingerings. Marcus was silently moving his fingers through passages while he ate. Other auditioners looked stressed and worried, but Sarah felt peaceful. She had done everything she could to prepare. The rest was up to courage, and she had finally found plenty of that. At 2:30 p.m., 15 minutes before auditions began, Sarah walked to the music room. Mrs. Henderson was arranging chairs and setting up her evaluation sheets. The piano, a regular, upright, not nearly as beautiful as the grand piano in storage, sat waiting. "Good afternoon, Sarah," Mrs. Henderson said with her usual polite smile. "Are you ready to play for Elise for us?" Sarah took a deep breath and looked her teacher directly in the eyes. "Actually, Mrs. Henderson, I'd like to play something different." The teacher's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Different? But we agreed on Für Elise. It's perfect for your skill level." "I know we did," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But I've been practicing something else, and I think it better shows what I can do." Mrs. Henderson looked confused and slightly annoyed. "Sarah, audition pieces aren't supposed to be changed at the last minute. What exactly have you been practicing?" Sarah met her teacher's eyes and said the words that would change everything. Chopin's Revolutionary Etude. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Mrs. Henderson stared at Sarah as if she had just claimed she could fly to the moon. The music teacher blinked several times, as if trying to make sure she had heard correctly. "I'm sorry, did you say Chopin's Revolutionary Etude?" Mrs. Henderson's voice was carefully controlled, but Sarah could hear the disbelief underneath. "Yes, ma'am. Sarah, that piece is—" Mrs. Henderson paused, searching for the right words. "It's one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano literature. Graduate students spend months preparing it. Professional pianists consider it a challenge." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it, but her voice stayed steady. "I know it's difficult, but I've been practicing it and I think I can play it well." Other students had started arriving for their auditions. Jessica walked in carrying her music folder, followed by Marcus and 3 other advanced students. They all stopped talking when they heard the conversation between Sarah and Mrs. Henderson. "Where did you even get the sheet music for that piece?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "I found it online," Sarah said simply. Mrs. Henderson looked around the room, at the other students, then back at Sarah. Her expression was a mixture of concern and frustration. "Sarah, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I cannot allow you to audition with a piece that is clearly beyond your abilities. It would be unfair to you and to the other students." "But what if it's not beyond my abilities?" Sarah asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Jessica and Marcus exchanged glances that said, "Is this really happening?" Mrs. Henderson sighed deeply. "Sarah, I've been teaching music for 25 years. I know my students' capabilities. The Revolutionary Etude requires technical skills that take years to develop. Students need to work up to that level gradually with proper instruction and—" "Could I just try?" Sarah interrupted, her voice stronger now. "If I can't play it, then I'll switch to Für Elise. But could you at least let me attempt it?" The room fell completely silent. Everyone was looking at Sarah with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. Jessica whispered something to Marcus that sounded like, "This is going to be painful to watch." Mrs. Henderson looked at the clock on the wall. Auditions were supposed to start in 5 minutes, and she had 6 students to hear. She clearly wanted to end this conversation quickly and get back to her planned schedule. "Sarah, I really don't think— Please." Sarah's voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made everyone pay attention. "I know you don't think I can do it. I know everyone thinks I'm just the quiet girl who plays simple songs. But I'm asking for one chance to show you who I really am." Mrs. Henderson studied Sarah's face for a long moment. Maybe she saw something there that she had never noticed before. Or maybe she just realized that saying no would take longer than letting Sarah try and fail quickly. "All right," Mrs. Henderson said finally. "But when you realize you can't handle it, you'll need to switch to Fur-Elise immediately. I won't allow you to waste everyone's time struggling through something impossible." "I understand," Sarah said. Mrs. Henderson gestured toward the piano bench. "Go ahead then. Let's get this over with." Sarah walked to the piano on unsteady legs. Her hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear. She was shaking from excitement, from the knowledge that she was about to reveal the secret she had been keeping for weeks. She sat down at the bench and adjusted her position. The upright piano felt different from the grand piano she had been practicing on, but all pianos spoke the same language. She placed her hands over the keys and took a deep breath. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Henderson settling into her chair with her evaluation sheets. The other students had arranged themselves around the room to watch. Sarah could feel their eyes on her back, waiting for her to fail. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment and thought about her grandmother's words. "The brave choices gave me the life I truly wanted." This was her brave choice. Sarah opened her eyes, positioned her hands, and began to play. The opening chord of the revolutionary etude crashed through the room like thunder. It was so sudden and powerful that Jessica actually jumped in her seat. The sound filled every corner of the music room, announcing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Sarah's left hand began the famous rolling passages that had given her so much trouble when she first started learning the piece. But now, after weeks of intense practice, her fingers moved through the difficult sequences with growing confidence. The notes tumbled over each other like water rushing down a mountain. Above the technical complexity of her left hand, Sarah's right hand began to sing Chopin's defiant melody. This was the part of the piece that had always spoken to her heart, the tune that seemed to say, "I will not be defeated, I will not be silenced, I will show you what I am capable of." Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open. This was not the adequate student she thought she knew. This was someone entirely different. The music continued to pour from the piano with increasing intensity. Sarah's fingers moved through passages that should have been impossible for someone at her supposed skill level. Her hands crossed and uncrossed as the melody shifted between them. Her whole body swayed with the emotion of the piece. Sarah was no longer thinking about technique or finger positions or anything her teacher had taught her in class. She was simply letting the music flow through her like electricity. Every frustration she had felt, every time she had been underestimated, every moment she had sat in the back row wishing she could show what she was really capable of, it all poured into Chopin's revolutionary music. The other students were completely transfixed. Marcus had forgotten to breathe. Jessica's prepared Chopin piece suddenly seemed small and safe compared to what she was hearing. None of them had ever seen Sarah as anything more than a background presence in their classes, but the person playing piano right now commanded the entire room. As Sarah moved into the most technically challenging section of the piece, her left hand flying through rapid scales and arpeggios, Mrs. Henderson realized she was witnessing something she had never expected to see in her classroom. This quiet girl, whom she had dismissed as merely adequate, was playing one of the most difficult pieces in the piano literature with skill and passion that some of her graduate students couldn't match. The melody reached its climactic high point, Sarah's right hand stretching across the keyboard to hit notes that sang with pure emotion. Her left hand continued its relentless revolutionary rhythm underneath, never faltering, never hesitating. Sarah was no longer in the music room at Lincoln High School. She was in 1831 with Chopin, feeling his heartbreak over his homeland and his determination to let the world know that the Polish spirit could not be crushed. She was every person who had ever been underestimated, every dreamer who had been told to be realistic, every quiet voice that had finally found the courage to sing. As the piece built toward its conclusion, Sarah played with an intensity that seemed to light up the entire room. Her fingers had never moved so fast or so precisely. Her heart had never been so completely poured into music. The final measures approached, the dramatic conclusion that would either crown her triumph or expose any remaining weaknesses in her preparation. Sarah's hands positioned themselves for the last powerful chords, the musical equivalent of planting a flag on a conquered mountain. She struck the final notes with all the power and conviction she possessed, and the sound rang through the room, like a declaration of independence. Then, silence. Sarah sat at the piano bench, breathing hard, her hands still resting on the keys. She had done it. She had played the entire revolutionary etude without a single major mistake. More than that, she had played it with the passion and skill it deserved. Slowly, she turned around to face the room. The silence in the room was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. She turned around slowly to face the audience, and what she saw took her breath away. Mrs. Henderson was sitting in her chair with her mouth still hanging open, her evaluation sheets forgotten in her lap. Her eyes were wide with shock, as if she had just witnessed something impossible. Behind her, the 6 students who had come for auditions were frozen in place like statues. Jessica's face showed pure amazement, mixed with something that might have been respect. Marcus was shaking his head slowly as if trying to wake up from a dream. The other students looked like they had just seen a magic trick and couldn't figure out how it was done. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the classroom clock and Sarah's own breathing, which was still fast from the intensity of her performance. Finally, Mrs. Henderson found her voice. "Sarah," she began, then stopped. She tried again. "That was... I don't understand. How did you..." Sarah stood up from the piano bench, her legs still shaky from adrenaline. "I've been practicing," she said simply. "Practicing?" Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked slightly. "Sarah, that piece. Do you understand what you just played? That was Chopin's Revolutionary Etude, Opera 10, number 12. That's a piece that piano majors in college struggle with. That's a piece that requires years of advanced training." "I know what it is," Sarah said quietly. Mrs. Henderson stood up from her chair, her evaluation sheets falling to the floor. She walked toward Sarah with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Where did you learn to play like that? Who's been teaching you?" "Nobody taught me that piece," Sarah said. "I learned it myself." "That's impossible." Sarah met her teacher's eyes steadily. "No, Mrs. Henderson, it's not impossible. You just never thought I could do it." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Mrs. Henderson's face went through several different expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something that might have been shame. "But your playing in class, your technique, you never showed any sign that you had this level of ability." "You never asked me to show this level of ability," Sarah replied. "You gave me simple songs because you thought that's all I could handle. So that's what I played." Jessica suddenly found her voice. "Sarah, that was incredible. I had no idea you could play like that." Marcus nodded in agreement. "I've been studying that etude for 2 years and I can barely get through it. You just played it like a professional." Sarah looked around the room at her classmates, the same students who had whispered about how boring she was, who had never included her in their conversations about music. Now they were looking at her with expressions of genuine respect and amazement. "How long have you been able to play at this level?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice smaller than usual. "I've been teaching myself for years," Sarah said. "Online, tutorials, free sheet music, practice whenever I could find a decent piano. I've been learning pieces like this for a long time. I just never had a place to play them properly until recently." "Where have you been practicing?" Mrs. Henderson asked. Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to get Mr. Johnson in trouble. "I found a place to practice on a better piano," she said carefully. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had just heard and seen. Finally, she spoke again. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I clearly misjudged your abilities. I don't understand how I missed seeing this talent." "Maybe you weren't looking for it," Sarah said, not unkindly but honestly. The truth of those words seemed to hit Mrs. Henderson hard. She sat back down in her chair and stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. "You're absolutely right," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "I made assumptions about you based on... I don't even know what." Your quiet personality? Your simple clothes? The fact that you sat in the back row? She shook her head. I'm supposed to be a music teacher. I'm supposed to recognize talent wherever I find it. But I completely failed to see what was right in front of me. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and sympathy for her teacher. She had spent so many months feeling hurt by Mrs. Henderson's dismissive attitude, but now she could see that the teacher was genuinely shocked by her own oversight. What I don't understand, said Marcus, is why you didn't tell us you could play like this before. Why did you let us think you were just, boring? Sarah finished for him. Not very good, just adequate? Marcus looked embarrassed. Well, yeah. Sarah thought about how to answer. Because nobody asked. And because when I did try to show interest in more challenging music, I was told to focus on the basics. While I learned to keep my real abilities to myself. Mrs. Henderson winced at this. Sarah, did I ever specifically discourage you from attempting more difficult pieces? You told me to focus on mastering the basics first, Sarah said. You said some students have natural talent and others work hard and do their best. You made it clear which group you thought I was in. The memory of that conversation hung heavy in the room. Mrs. Henderson looked genuinely distressed. I remember saying that, she admitted. I thought I was being kind, managing your expectations so you wouldn't be disappointed. I had no idea I was crushing your spirit. You weren't crushing my spirit, Sarah said. You just made me find another way to nurture it. Jessica spoke up again. Sarah, will you audition for the recital with that piece? Please? I want everyone to hear you play like that. Sarah looked around the room at her classmates, all of whom were nodding encouragement. Then she looked at Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson, I know this isn't the piece you expected me to audition with. I know it's not what you planned. If you think Für Elise would be better for the recital. Are you joking? Mrs. Henderson interrupted. Sarah, what you just played was the most impressive audition I've heard in 25 years of teaching. If you're comfortable performing the revolutionary etude, it would be an honor to have you play it in our recital. Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. Really? Really. In fact, I think you should be our closing performer. That piece deserves to end the show. The other students burst into spontaneous applause. Sarah had gone from being an afterthought to being the featured performer in the span of one audition. There's just one thing, Mrs. Henderson said as the applause died down. I need to understand how you developed this level of skill without proper instruction. Not because I doubt what I just heard, but because I want to help you develop your talent properly from now on. Sarah thought about the storage room with the grand piano, about her online tutorials, about the years of practicing in secret. I found ways to challenge myself. I found better instruments to practice on. And I found music that spoke to my heart instead of just music that was safe. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. I think there's a lesson in this for all of us. Sarah, would you be willing to meet with me tomorrow to discuss your musical development? I'd like to help you prepare for some serious opportunities. What kind of opportunities? Sarah asked. Competitions, scholarships, music conservatory auditions. Sarah, with proper guidance and support, you could have a real future as a professional musician. Sarah felt the room spinning slightly. An hour ago, she had been the quiet girl in the back row. Now her teacher was talking about music conservatories and professional careers. I'd like that very much, Sarah managed to say. Mrs. Henderson smiled, the first genuine warm smile she had ever directed at Sarah. Good. And Sarah, thank you for reminding me why I became a music teacher in the first place, to discover and nurture talent wherever it appears, not just where I expect to find it. As Sarah gathered her backpack to leave, her classmates crowded around her with questions and compliments. For the first time since starting high school, Sarah felt like she truly belonged in the music room. But more importantly, she had finally shown the world who she really was. The quiet girl in the back row was gone forever. In her place stood a young woman who had found her voice and wasn't afraid to use it. The revolutionary etude had been the perfect choice after all. It was music written by someone who refused to be silenced, played by someone who had finally decided to be heard. And everyone in that room would remember this audition for the rest of their lives. 3 weeks later, on the night of the spring recital, Lincoln High School's auditorium was packed with more people than Sarah had ever seen for a school music event. Word had somehow spread throughout the community about the quiet student who had shocked everyone with her incredible audition. Parents, teachers, and even some local music lovers had come to hear what all the fuss was about. Sarah stood backstage in the wings, wearing a simple black dress that her grandmother had bought, specially for the occasion. Her hands were calm, which surprised her. After the intensity of the audition, performing the revolutionary etude in front of a large audience felt less terrifying than she had expected. 5 minutes until your performance, Mrs. Henderson whispered as she approached. Over the past 3 weeks, the relationship between Sarah and her teacher had completely transformed. Mrs. Henderson had arranged for Sarah to have private lessons with a professor from the nearby university. She had also helped Sarah apply for summer music programs and even mentioned the possibility of scholarship auditions for music conservatories. "How do you feel?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Ready," Sarah said simply. Mrs. Henderson smiled. "You know, I've been thinking about that day in my office when you asked for more challenging music. I told you to focus on the basics because I thought I was protecting you from disappointment, but I realize now that I was really protecting myself." "What do you mean?" "I was protecting myself from having to admit that I had failed to see your talent. It was easier to keep you in a small box than to acknowledge that I had been wrong about you from the beginning." Sarah looked at her teacher with understanding. "We all do that sometimes. We see what we expect to see instead of what's really there." "You're very wise for someone so young," Mrs. Henderson said. "Sarah, I want you to know that what happened in that audition changed me as a teacher. I've started looking at all my students differently now, wondering what hidden talents I might be missing." From the auditorium came the sound of applause as Marcus finished his Bach invention. His performance had been excellent, polished, and technically perfect. Jessica had played her Chopin piece beautifully earlier in the evening, receiving enthusiastic applause from the audience. Now it was Sarah's turn. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of the principal over the microphone, "our final performer tonight is Sarah Chen, who will be playing Chopin's Revolutionary Etude in C minor." A murmur went through the audience. Many people recognized the name of the piece and knew how challenging it was. Some were skeptical that a high school student could handle such difficult music. Others had heard rumors about Sarah's audition and were eager to see if the stories were true. Sarah walked onto the stage and the auditorium fell quiet. The stage lights were bright and warm, and she could see the faces in the front rows clearly. Her grandmother sat in the third row, wearing her best dress and beaming with pride. Next to her sat Mr. Johnson, the janitor who had discovered Sarah practicing in the storage room. He had asked if he could attend the recital, and Sarah had made sure he got a good seat. Sarah approached the grand piano at center stage, a beautiful concert instrument that had been rented specially for the recital. It was even more magnificent than the old piano in the storage room, where she had discovered her true abilities. She sat down at the bench and adjusted her position. The auditorium was completely silent now, hundreds of people waiting to hear what this quiet girl could do. Sarah placed her hands over the keys and took a deep breath. She thought about her journey from the back row of music class to this moment on stage. She thought about all the times she had been called adequate, all the nights she had practiced in secret, all the courage it had taken to reveal who she really was. Then she began to play. The opening chord thundered through the auditorium with such power that some people in the audience actually jumped in their seats. The sound was magnificent, filling every corner of the large space with Chopin's revolutionary fire. Sarah's left hand launched into the famous rolling passages, and immediately the audience could tell they were hearing something extraordinary. Her fingers moved with precision and confidence, each note crystal clear despite the incredible speed of the passages. Above the technical brilliance of her left hand, Sarah's right hand began to sing Chopin's defiant melody. But tonight, on the stage with this magnificent piano, the music had even more power than it had during her audition. Sarah was no longer just playing notes on a page. She was telling her own story through Chopin's music. The melody sang of being underestimated and finding strength in silence. It spoke of discovering hidden talents and having the courage to reveal them to the world. It was the musical voice of everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough, everyone who had ever surprised others with their capabilities. As Sarah moved through the most technically demanding sections of the piece, the audience sat, transfixed. Parents who had come expecting a typical high school recital found themselves witnessing a performance that belonged on a professional concert stage. Some people were actually crying, moved by the combination of technical brilliance and emotional depth in Sarah's playing. Mrs. Henderson stood in the wings, with tears streaming down her face. She had heard Sarah play this piece several times, during lessons over the past 3 weeks, but tonight was different. Tonight, Sarah was playing not just for an audience, but for everyone who had ever doubted her, including herself. The music built to its climactic high point, Sarah's hands, dancing across the keyboard with supernatural grace and power. She had transcended the technical challenges of the piece and was now purely expressing the joy and freedom of being able to share her true self with the world. In the audience, her grandmother clasped her hands together and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Mr. Johnson wiped his eyes with his handkerchief, amazed at how far the quiet girl from the storage room had come. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Sarah felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. This moment represented everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of, everything she had been afraid to hope for. She was no longer hiding her light under a bushel. She was letting it shine as brightly as possible. The final measures approached, the dramatic conclusion that would crown her transformation from invisible student to celebrated musician. Sarah's hands positioned themselves for the last powerful chords, and she struck them with all the conviction and passion in her heart. The final notes rang through the auditorium like church bells, echoing off the walls and ceiling before gradually fading into silence. For a moment that seemed to last forever, nobody moved. The audience sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Then slowly one person began to clap, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium had erupted in thunderous applause. People were not just clapping. They were cheering, whistling, and calling out words of appreciation. The ovation went on, with some audience members rising to their feet, then more, until the entire crowd was standing and applauding. Sarah stood up from the piano bench and took her bow, her face flushed with exhaustion and triumph. She had done more than just perform a difficult piece of music. She had revealed her true self to the world and been embraced for who she really was. As the applause continued, Sarah looked out at the audience and saw faces filled with joy, amazement, and respect. These were the same community members who had known her as just another quiet student. Now they were seeing her as an artist, a musician worthy of their admiration. Mrs. Henderson joined Sarah on stage, taking her own bow as her student's teacher. As they stood together acknowledging the applause, Mrs. Henderson leaned over and whispered, "Sarah, this is just the beginning. You have a gift that the world needs to hear." When the applause finally died down, Sarah walked off stage to find herself surrounded by well-wishers. Students, parents, teachers, and community members all wanted to congratulate her and express their amazement at what they had witnessed. But the moment that meant the most came when her grandmother wrapped her in a tight hug. "I am so proud of you, little bird," her grandmother whispered in her ear. "You chose brave and now you can fly." 6 months later, Sarah received a full scholarship to attend the prestigious Eastman School of Music. The quiet girl who had once sat in the back row of music class was now preparing for a career as a professional pianist. But more importantly, Sarah had learned that her greatest enemy had never been other people's expectations of her. It had been her own willingness to accept those limited expectations as truth. The day she decided to play the revolutionary etude instead of Für Elise was the day she stopped letting other people define what she was capable of achieving. Sarah Chen had found her voice, and she would never be quiet again. Years later, when Sarah performed with symphony orchestras around the world, she would often think back to that spring recital at Lincoln High School. It was the night when a teenager from a small apartment above a Chinese restaurant proved that extraordinary talent can emerge from the most unexpected places. But it was also the night when everyone in that auditorium, including Mrs. Henderson, including Sarah herself, learned that we should never assume we know the limits of what someone can accomplish.